via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. President Truman will be kicking off today's webinar, followed by Dr. Tom Schwartz.
Say around the world, the people look to the American farmer for food.
And the people around the world, especially the starving people, were looking to the American farmer to feed them.
Okay.
When I became president of the United States, I'm thinking about it, and I went to work to try to get it done.
So what you're seeing is a letter that President Truman penned and sent to former President Hoover on May 24th, 1945. And it reads, "My dear Mr. President, if you should be in Washington, I'd be most happy to talk over the European food situation with you. Also, it would be a pleasure to me to become acquainted with you. Most sincerely, Harry S. Truman." Now, the letter seems pretty innocuous and friendly and kind of a wanting to meet the former president, whom he had not known. But actually, the letter represents a many-week effort of kind of behind the scenes of Truman trying to get Hoover's associates and friends to get him to pay a visit to the president in Washington. Hoover was a bit suspicious. For 12 years under the Roosevelt administration, he had been exiled from the White House. A number of New Dealers tried to get FDR to bring him in on certain policy issues in which Hoover was the foremost authority. And Roosevelt finally lost his temper and said, "I'm not Jesus Christ, and I'm not going to raise Hoover from the dead." Hoover kept telling the friends, urging him to visit Truman, said, "You don't just stop in to visit the president. He invites you." And so Truman decided to kind of break the logjam, send Hoover this note, in which Hoover responded, said he'd be happy to meet with the president and to have one of his staff set up an appointment. Next slide, please.
One of the president's forward-looking acts is to seek the advice of former President Hoover in the administration of food relief to Europe. Arriving at the White House, Mr. Hoover is greeted by the president, who will benefit by Mr. Hoover's vast experience in food administration during World War I. A wise counselor in time of need.
So why was this meeting so important to President Truman? They met 4 days after Truman penned the original note. And it was largely because Hoover pioneered and wrote the playbook on how to feed tens of millions of people with limited food, limited resources, and in time of emergency and famine. Hoover essentially created the model for the non-governmental organizations when he created the Commission for Relief in Belgium in 1914. From 1914 really to the end of the war, Hoover raised over $1 billion to feed 8 million non-combatants in the German-occupied areas of Belgium and northern France. And those were 1910s dollars, not adjusted for current valuation. And he did it with administrative costs of less than 0.5%. When the US got involved in the war, Hoover turned the commission over to other people, came back to the United States, and Wilson immediately put him in his cabinet to head the US Food Administration. There, Hoover got Americans to voluntarily reduce consumption of essential foodstuffs by 15% in order to provide it for the war effort. After the war, Hoover was put in charge of the American Relief Administration, which spent over $800 million to feed, again, civilian populations in the war-ravaged countries in Europe and elsewhere. In 1921 through 23, Hoover fed over 20 million Russians during the Russian Civil War, feeding both civilians in areas controlled by the Bolshevik government as well as the White Russian government. Then in 1939, he also had food relief efforts to try to provide food to Poland and Finland at the beginning of the war. So Hoover wrote the playbook. He was the expert in this subject matter. They talked for over an hour on food relief and other topics. At the conclusion, Hoover agreed to send Truman a memo discussing the points that they had been part of their talk. 2 days later, Hoover sends over an 18-type page memorandum, which Truman then distributes to members of his cabinet, including Secretary of Agriculture Clinton Anderson. Then in February of 46, Anderson phones Hoover, who's fishing down in Florida, indicating the president would like him to be part of the Famine Emergency Committee, sends down an airplane to fly Hoover back to Washington to attend the first meeting on March 1st. And so thus, that's the beginning of Hoover's return to rehabilitation, kind of, and the beginning of what become a lifelong friendship with Truman and service and public policy. So to continue this story of the food relief effort, Sam Rochelle, take it.
Okay. Yes. Next slide, please. Following up here on what Mr. Schwartz said, and that is that these are photographs here of Harry Truman just a few months after he took office in April of 1945, when he unexpectedly became president of the United States. He was anxious to visit with his counterparts, Winston Churchill of Great Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, to discuss ending World War II against Japan, and also the food relief efforts and rehabilitation efforts of Germany, which had surrendered in May of 1945. And these photographs here, I think, are really indicative of the conditions in Berlin. That's where the Potsdam Conference occurred, Potsdam being a suburb of Berlin. And here in this left photograph, we have Harry Truman touring the city, the ruined city, where he got a real firsthand glimpse of the suffering of the people. And this is important because it really helps motivate his efforts to promote food relief through Mr. Hoover. He wrote to his wife on July 20th, 1945, he wrote to Bess that Berlin, quote, is a hell of a place. Ruined, dirty, smelly, forlorn people, bedraggled, hangdog look about them. You never saw as completely ruined a city, end quote. In his diary, he wrote of, quote, absolute ruin, old men, old women, young women, children from tots to teens, carrying packs, pushing carts, pulling carts, evidently ejected by the conquerors and carrying what they could of their belongings to nowhere in particular. The photo on the right is a still photo of Berlin, citizens walking in Berlin. It's a still from the post-war documentary called Seeds of Destiny, which was a propaganda documentary film to support the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It raised over $200 million for war relief and won an Academy Award. Next slide, please. When people think of foreign aid to Europe, the Marshall Plan is usually what comes to mind. The Marshall Plan provided about $13 billion in recovery. But before the Marshall Plan, between 1945 and 1948, the United States provided almost as much money, about $11 billion to Europe. And the Marshall Plan was by no means the first U.S. aid program for post-war Germany and the rest of Europe. And just to say briefly about the Marshall Plan, it was kind of an effort to bundle existing rival programs together into an aid package that would iron out and eliminate inconsistencies, and inefficiencies. Okay, that's kind of background for this document here, dated April 18 of 1946. It's written by a man named William Hallam Tuck, who was a close friend of Hoover, and he's writing on Hoover's behalf to Mr. Truman. Tuck was a close friend of Herbert Hoover, was in the Belgian American Educational Foundation, and was actively involved in Hoover's post-war relief organizations. And this document, which Craig Wright will say more about later in terms of Hoover's travels, tells you that Hoover was involved in many travels around the world. And this talks about the seriousness of the situation. This is, again, April of 1946. And the emphasis on the maximum effort to increase shipments of cereals and fats to Europe. It will be needed if widespread suffering and starvation are to be minimized. Next slide, please. What we're going to hear here is Herbert Hoover himself talking about the conditions
All
in
Europe
Europe.
is normal, and the suffering is intense. We must try to prevent starvation in other nations. We cannot escape the obligation to use our every resource to prevent starvation.
Okay, that recording occurs in 1946, and it's the backdrop again is the terrible conditions that are occurring in Europe, which was also beset by a very bad winter in winter of 1946 to 47, which we'll say more about later. But that also exacerbates the problems that post-war Europe is facing, not only the challenges of the destruction during World War II, but also the terrible winter that beset the continent. In their meeting that occurred on May 28, 1945, which Mr. Schwartz has already alluded to, Truman wrote that he and Hoover, quote, had a pleasant and constructive conversation on food and the general troubles of U.S. presidents, two in particular, end quote. Truman felt that Hoover, as the only living former president, could really relate to Truman's problems in a unique way. And Truman also felt that former presidents should be treated with respect. Arranging that meeting had been no easy task, however, because many of Truman's advisors, many of whom were Roosevelt holdovers, were staunchly opposed to it. But one of the key figures here was Henry Stimson, who was Truman's Secretary of War and Herbert Hoover's Secretary of State. Stimson was a key figure in making this first meeting happen and in Hoover's subsequent involvement in food aid. Briefly, Truman asked Hoover to help address the world food crisis, and in doing so, was named honorary chairman of the Famine Emergency Committee. But this was no figurehead position. It was not an honorary position. It was a working position. And in effect, Mr. Hoover became Truman's food ambassador, traveling around the world to determine needs and sources of supplies and to coordinate world efforts to master the danger to millions of lives. Hoover played a key role in the Famine Emergency Committee. He had Truman's ear on crucial issues. For example, persuading Truman to accept famine relief through voluntarism, which is a key tenet of Herbert Hoover's philosophy, over rationing. And rationing had been really pushed by some of the other members of the administration. Hoover assessed the world needs of Europe and Asia and Latin America. We'll say more about that later. He visited 38 countries and traveled 50,000 miles in just 3 months. There were 3 basic trips. One was to Europe, another to Latin America and South America, and then a third trip to Germany and Austria. Truman was interested in having Hoover return to the U.S., though, and talk to the American people about what he'd seen in his travels abroad. Hoover announced to the American people that, quote, "It is now 11:59 on the clock of starvation," end quote, in Europe. On March 16, 1946, in a radio address, Hoover told of the incredible scale of world famine. 500 million people were affected. For Hoover, saving lives was a, quote, moral and spiritual duty. Will you not take to your table an invisible guest, he told the American people, alluding to the hunger abroad, unseen millions. Harry Truman himself addressed a radio audience in April of 1946, mentioned that Hoover was a member of this famine emergency committee. He told the American people that America was faced with a solemn obligation to help hungry people. He called for conservation and sacrifice of bread, oils, and fats, which were needed in Europe. And Hoover himself, in his report, emphasized the need for cereals, as we saw in this earlier document. This is important here, and Hoover's involvement helped make the food program a bipartisan effort. Herbert Hoover was a Republican, conservative. Harry Truman was a Democrat. Still, that's not to underestimate the political differences the two men had. They did have political differences that we don't have time to get into here, unfortunately. Next slide, please. No, sorry, we're at the slide we want to be, pardon me. And this slide shows Harry Truman on the left, Herbert Hoover in the center, and Clinton Anderson, Secretary of Agriculture, on the right. And what's important here is to talk briefly about Secretary Anderson's role, which was really important. The challenge was to encourage American farmers to produce more goods by giving them the incentive of higher prices. Now, that was a two-edged sword, however, because American consumers didn't want to pay those higher prices. The higher prices would be the incentive to grow more and export more grains and cereals. Americans wanted fewer restrictions and more food, especially meat. But Americans did their part. Higher farm prices and the removal of price controls that were imposed during the war did increase farm production. And Harry Truman himself issued conservation orders in February 1946 to divert dairy and grain supplies to famine relief in Europe. And importantly, the U.S. reached its goal of sending 6 million tons of grains to Europe by July of 1946. However, the American people were not too happy about it. They did their part, but the Truman and the Democrats paid at the polls. They went down to defeat in the 1946 congressional elections and off-year election. In large part, because of frustration over high meat and food prices. And so next slide, please. Food relief was a grassroots effort. In July 1946, President Truman met with the Youth Food Conference called by the Famine Emergency Committee. There were local food councils. Food conservation and education emphasis were all important. And Truman told the group, which represented youth from across the United States, that, quote, it is going to take another year or two, maybe 3, before those countries can get back on a production basis so that they can even contribute to their own support. We are going to help them all we can with machinery and tools and the wherewithal to raise food. But it will be some time before those destroyed countries can get back to a basis where they feed themselves. So I think with that, we're going to turn it over to Mr. Wright.
The post-World War II food relief effort was really built on a foundation laid by Hoover's previous food relief efforts that Tom had outlined earlier. There was a core group of people, back one. There was a core group of people that had assisted him in his earlier efforts, and they had stayed in touch through the ARA Alumni Association. And so Hoover actually had associates or contacts that had been vetted by associates in all of the countries that he visited. That image that was on briefly is from the cover of their association's magazine. It was sort of a call to service for all the folks who had helped Hoover in the past. Left is Herbert Hoover watching home. Whoops, there we go. That's the call to action. We'll have to feed the world again. And of course, the call was answered by many people around the world. The picture on the left of Hoover watching sort of homeless people in Warsaw being fed, real to me is sort of the epitome of Hoover's food relief philosophy. Really, all of his efforts had started with the idea that children are important in future generations. So children come first, and then these efforts expand to others as more money becomes available. On the right there, you can see Hoover leaving a plane. The the plane originally assigned to Hoover was a standard airline version of a DC-4, but since he's nearly 72 years old and not in the best of health, and it's sort of a grueling trip ahead, Frank Mason worked some back channels, and arrangements were made for a modified DC-4 with bunks, meeting spaces, and an Army doctor to make sure Mr. Hoover made it through. They sort of mimicked Air Force One at the time was known as the Sacred Cow, and Hoover's plane was named the Faithful Cow. There was a second DC-4 filled with repair parts and engines and such that would follow 15 to 20 minutes behind Hoover's plane, and this actually proved very helpful. When they were taxiing the field to leave Peru, a tire blew, and since everything was at hand, everything was fixed in 20 minutes, and they were on their way again. Next slide, please. You see is a map of the first leg, the European section of the first trip, which was to Europe and Asia. And there's this rather beautiful scrapbook that was presented to Hoover after the trip. Just sort of reiterate what Sam said. There was a second trip to Central and South America, and then a trip to Germany and Austria in '47. There's a lot of resistance to feeding our former enemies, and General Lucius Clay, who was the deputy military governor of the American sector in Germany, felt that without Hoover's advocacy, they would not have gotten adequate supplies in Germany. All righty, next please. One of the more critical, here's Mr. Hoover with the Pope, but it's sort of illustrating one of the most critical partners they were hoping to get involved in this process was Argentina, due to their large food surpluses that they had. The relations between the United States and Juan Perón were not really very amicable at the time, and Hoover has a plan. So he's already planning for the second trip by meeting with the Pope, and he was getting an introduction from him that would state that Hoover was not so much just representing the United States, but that he was representing all of the starving people of the world and had the full support of the church. So that's sort of part one of his plan, and we'll get part two a little bit later. Next, please. These images are from Poland, and on the left, you see Hoover viewing the site of a statue that was erected to him after World War I due to his food relief efforts in Poland at that time. Sort of amusing, Hoover claimed that the Germans had destroyed it during World War II, but it turns out it was really made of vastly inferior material that sort of decayed over time, and it sort of fell apart. On the right, it's one of my favorite. We have a large collection of what I think are really engaging photos of people trying to continue life as best they can in the ruins of World War II. That's in Warsaw there. Next, please. On a lighter note than all these photos of ruins that we saw, here is Hoover in Copenhagen and being given a gift of fish. Folks who know about Herbert Hoover know that he was an avid fisherman and really loved fishing. It was one of his his favorite hobby, without a doubt. And although I think he was his most eloquent when talking about children or responding to letters from children, talking about fishing came in a close second. So here we see Hoover delighted with his gift of fish. Next, please. Now, this is from that same scrapbook and a map of the second leg through Asia. Now, this almost didn't happen. Truman sent Hoover a telegram on April 18th 1946, saying there was an urgent need for him to return to the United States and make the case to the American people to sort of shore up support for these efforts the two men were undertaking. Uh, Herbert Hoover was really disinclined to do so. He's sort of in his element. He is so grateful to be doing public service again. One commentator mentioned that he must have lost 30 pounds during the course of this trip. And another commentator mentioned that he looked 10 years younger at the end of the trip than when he had started. So as a compromise, Hoover delivers a radio address that was broadcast in the United States from Cairo, which sort of served the purpose of making the case to the American public. And then Hoover was allowed to continue on his trip through Asia. Next, please. Here we see Herbert Hoover with Gandhi, and yeah, obviously he met many VIPs during the course of his trip. There's a little story really about after they left India and on their way to Thailand, the Agriculture Department's representative in the little group was Dennis Fitzgerald, who was sort of co-piloting the plane during this leg to Thailand. And in front of them, there was coming to a rather large thunderstorm, and they realized this really wasn't. We'd rather take the time and fly around the storm rather than through it, only to find out as they were flying around it, they came into an even worse thunderstorm. And for 20 minutes, there was sort of extreme turbulence on the plane. Everything was shaking around. When things calmed down again, Fitzgerald went to check on Herbert Hoover, whose first comment was, "I'm not going to let you fly this plane anymore." Next. It's still in Asia. There's Hoover meeting with Madam Chiang Kai-shek in China, and a nice, my favorite picture of the faithful cow that's in our collection with the crew. Hoover was disinclined. Many governments wanted to give him expensive gifts, and it was pretty well known that he did not really like that. So most countries instead, they found out his love for smoking cigars, and they gave him many cigars to smoke. But Hoover was quite particular about his brand of cigar and had brought his own stash with him. So the crew of the Faithful Cow and his colleagues benefited from smoking cigars that were presidential gifts. Hoover often showed his appreciation for people that he had worked with by working behind the scenes for them. And in this case, he had a very good relationship that established with the Army doctor on the flight, Delbert Ray. And much to Ray's surprise, Hoover had secured a hospital position for him in California, ready for him as soon as he left the Army. Next. The second trip, so in Central and South America. While he was in Venezuela, Hoover had slipped in the bathtub and cracked some of his ribs. So he actually suffered through the rest of the trip in some kind of pain and duress, but tried to make the most of it. This is the picture of Juan Perón. And I mentioned phase one was sort of working with the Pope. The second part, and actually the meeting with Perón was not arranged through the State Department, but the Papal Nuncio in Buenos Aires. What Hoover and Truman had gotten together, and against the objections of the State Department, because this food of Argentina was so critical, they sort of worked out a deal where in exchange for Argentina shipping their grain to Europe, in return, Truman was going to lift some banking restrictions that were on Argentine gold that was deposited in U.S. banks. Next. As I mentioned, he wasn't really a fan of expensive gifts. It's really these kind of simple expressions of thanks from regular people, especially children, that really had an impact on Hoover, and he tends to talk much more about those than anything elaborate that he got. the impact of this trip, sort of get a quote here from Maurice Pate, who was one of the group that was on the trip. Pate would actually run the UNICEF from 1947 to 1965. Quote, this trip was important because, quote, it compiled detailed data that justified recommending equitable flow of food around the world and gave hope to 38 countries groping for guidance in the bewildered post-war world. This is actually a really nice transition slide, because the thank you on the left was sent to President Hoover, as you can see, and the thank you on the right was sent to President Truman, which allows me to send it back to Sam.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Craig. Yes, the letter on the right comes from a German school child named Ella Lieber. And she was 12 years old. And in 1948, she, along with more than 1 million Bavarian school children who were part of a competition to show their thanks for U.S. generosity, sent letters to Harry Truman. And this is one letter, the one on the right there, is in our collection at the Truman Library, in our museum collection. It's one of many. And this particular letter was published in a book a few years ago called Dear Mr. President, Letters to the Oval Office from the Files of the National Archives. And so this letter here on the right was identified as one of the treasures of the National Archives. The context was a thank you for school lunches. Craig mentioned how important children were to Herbert Hoover's efforts, and that's really true. He really treasured the aid he could provide to kids, particularly through school lunches. And in this case, Ella lived in the town of Pfaffenhofen, in Germany, and that's where this letter was written from. So next slide, please. In February 1947, Herbert Hoover undertook a mission to assess food situation in Germany and Austria. And they asked the question that taxpayers were asking themselves: why was it costing $600 million American and British taxpayers to feed our former enemy, Germany? That was a question that the taxpayers were asking, and some congressmen, particularly conservative congressmen, were asking as well. And for Hoover, the key was to revive German industry and Austrian industry, pay for its own food. That was the ultimate goal. And he took the same approach, that is Hoover and Harry Truman took the same approach to Japan, which was get Japan and Germany back on its feet, revive the economy to help feed people, prevent famine, and stop the spread of communism. Now, in the interim, though, however, food aid was necessary because the immediate crisis was starvation. So immediate direct U.S. aid was seen as necessary, in order to also help the economies get back on their feet as well. Okay, next slide, please. It's important, I mentioned the Marshall Plan too. The Marshall Plan also eventually overtook discussions of individual aid packages for Germany. The political aspects here are very important, and I'll speak to them briefly here. In February 28, 1947, Herbert Hoover urged congressional approval of President Truman's request for an additional $350 million for European relief. Hoover appeared before an open session of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, pictured here, and he told the committee that Congress should stop, look, and listen before creating an aid package for Europe, which he said was on the edge of starvation and needed $1 billion. And remarkably, this is almost 2 years after the end of World War II, and Europe is still struggling. And again, the context, though, is that Congress was divided on aid to Europe. As I mentioned before, the 1946 elections saw Republicans sweep into power and control both houses of Congress and control therefore the committees in Congress. And there were some very ardent non-interventionists in the U.S. Senate after 1946. So Mr. Hoover and Harry Truman had their work cut out for them. There was no foregone conclusion that Congress was going to rubber stamp hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in aid for Europe. And non-interventionists in the House, for example, included Missouri's Dewey Short, Carl Curtis of Nebraska, and John Rankin of Mississippi. In the Senate, non-interventionists included Robert Taft, Republican of Ohio, Kenneth Weary of Nebraska, and William Jenner of Indiana. All very questioned the foreign aid program, very powerful people. However, there was a key figure in the bipartisan foreign policy, which was Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, a Republican from Michigan. And on the House side, a powerful ally of the Truman administration was the man in the center of this photograph, Representative Charles Eaton, a Republican of New Jersey, and chairman of the committee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And the man on the far left there is Saul Bloom, a Democrat of New York. In his memoirs, Dean Acheson, who would become Secretary of State, described the immediate challenge at this time, this is February 1947, as Greece and Turkey, and Britain's inability to continue aid to these countries within the next 6 weeks. In fact, that's the title of a memoir of one of the State Department figures, 6 weeks. Just showed the kind of pressure that U.S. policymakers were under in the Truman administration. And Herbert Hoover was a very important ally here. The Truman administration basically felt it should step into the void. And then later, Harry Truman, a month later, issued what became known as the Truman Doctrine. And then General Marshall made a speech at Harvard outlining what became known as the Marshall Plan. So all this activity is occurring within a few months. Next slide, please. In this letter that you're going to see, Truman expresses his support for Herbert Hoover's missions. This is March of 1947. And it's an important letter, too. I mentioned there were opponents even to having Harry Truman meet with Herbert Hoover, whose name was very closely associated with the Great Depression for reasons fair and unfair. And so he was seen as a political anathema to some within the Truman inner circle. But Harry Truman saw the wealth of experience that Herbert Hoover brought to this issue and the wisdom that he brought, and reached across the political aisle and had Herbert Hoover do some very meaningful, important work. And again, you see here Truman in what is more than boilerplate express his very high appreciation for willingness to undertake surveys into Germany and Austria. And I'm sure it will have a bearing on the conference in Moscow. And what he's referring to there is the Foreign Ministers Conference, then underway, that unfortunately eventually failed to reach agreement on peace treaties with Germany and Austria. But between the Hoover missions, the $400 million aid package to Greece and Turkey, which was enunciated in the Truman Doctrine speech, and the $13 billion Marshall Plan, the United States helped feed Europe, provided markets for U.S. goods, prevented the spread of communism, and helped provide social and economic recovery in European societies. And Harry Truman, as late as October of 1947, is still speaking about the need for food conservation. In the first televised speech from the White House, Harry Truman spoke about food. He announced a food-saving program that was intended to conserve grains that could be shipped to Europe for humanitarian relief to avert famine. Again, this is about 2.5 years after the end of World War II. Step 1, use no meat on Tuesdays. Step 2, use no poultry or eggs on Thursdays. Step 3, save a slice of bread every day. Step 4, public eating places will serve bread and butter only on request. So again, Truman is still using the bully pulpit to try to get the American people to be on board with voluntary efforts. So at that, I will turn it over to Dr. Graham.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sam and Craig and Tom. That's been a great presentation. My role here is to pivot just a little bit and talk about the relationship between these two leaders. and what we might take away from that as it relates to what they were able to accomplish. And I want to do so from the vantage point of those of us who make our living in what we might broadly call the legacy business. I think it's important to remember these leaders for what they did, for what they accomplished. And what you've seen tonight is just a small slice of the legacy of each of these guys. This was not the main thing that either one of them is known for, but as you can imagine how important this was for people around the world to receive this kind of aid, and to know, and for us to know as Americans that it was delivered in this way, as Sam emphasized, across party lines, and across, the ideological divide. I think one of the reasons that those of us who work in libraries and work with these legacies are so passionate about what we do and love our jobs and love getting to do this for a living is that if you think about both of these guys you have on the screen right now, but for our work, Harry Truman might be remembered as the guy who left office with the lowest poll numbers in recorded history, largely, of course, because of the Korean conflict. And Herbert Hoover would be synonymous with economic collapse and all the great things that he accomplished as a humanitarian, as a philanthropist, as a logistical genius. All of that would be lost, but for, I think, the work that my colleagues here and many other historians and archivists and others have seen to. What comes out of this, I think, is an intense sense of public service. There's an ethic here that I think this food relief program represents. And I think it comes from who they were as individuals. Tom started off by reading a letter that Truman wrote to Mr. Hoover. But before that, I think one of the first communiques that Truman received as a new president when he was sworn in was a telegram from former President Hoover saying basically, you have a right to call on the people of the country. We need to be with you, and I am with you, and I'll help you in any way I can. And years later, I have a letter here I want to read just a portion of. This was a letter from President Hoover to President Truman regarding that relationship that they forged very early on. And as you've seen from the presentation tonight, Hoover had been basically cut out of any contact with the administration for the previous 12 years. So when Truman called him and said, no, I'd like to tap you, I'd like to use your expertise, that meant a lot to Hoover, obviously. And he writes it this way. He said, this is an occasion when I should like to add something more, because yours has been a friendship which has reached deeper into my life than you know. I gave up a successful profession in 1914 to enter public service. I served through the First World War and after for a total of about 18 years. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came, I at once supported the president and offered to serve in any useful capacity. Because of my varied experience during the First World War, I thought my services might again be useful. However, there was no response. My activities in the Second World War were limited to frequent requests from congressional committees. When you came to the White House, within a month, you opened the door to me, to the only profession I knew, public service, and you undid some disgraceful action that had been taken in the prior years. For all of this and your friendship, I am deeply grateful. Again, as Sam said earlier about the letter, this is not boilerplate. This isn't something that a secretary wrote and he signed. I mean, this is a heartfelt expression of thanks. And I think it gives you a sense that presidents are people too. They have personalities, they have egos, they have feelings. And it meant so much. And you think about what a tight-knit group that is. Even today, the former living presidents, they form a kind of bond, even though they are wildly different in what they fought for and what they believe. Hoover and Truman ideologically could probably not be any more different than any other two leaders we could name in the 20th century. And yet, they formed a genuine friendship. And I think that's so critical. You think about the level of decency and the service ethic that is on display here. These men were substantive and they were real. And I think there is a kind of capacity here, and a kind of integrity in both of them that met over a problem like this. How are we going to feed the world? These guys knew that this had to be done, and they were able to overcome whatever differences. I mean, Herbert Hoover was able to overcome whatever hurt feelings he might have had. Truman overcame the objections of some of his cabinet members and others that said, why would we bring a Republican? Why would we bring, I mean, leave him pinned with everything that went wrong? Why would we try to help him in any way? I think Harry Truman had a lot of reasons for wanting to help him. And one is because he wanted to help the world. And he knew that Herbert Hoover had the capacity to do that. I think both of these guys were real leaders in the true sense of the word. And I hearken back to the founding, of which they were both students, when the founders used the term disinterested. And the term disinterested did not mean uninterested. It meant impartial. It meant that you could rise above the fray and be a true Republican with a small r. It had nothing to do with the party, but just this notion of republicanism was about one thing. It was about putting the public good ahead of personal, private self-interest. And I think in Harry Truman and Herbert Hoover, we have the definition of a disinterested Republican, the founders would have said gentleman, who can rise above the fray and who can swallow their pride, who can forego the kind of money they can make in the private sector, whatever, to come into public service and to cross party lines and to be able to overcome whatever political differences exist to accomplish a great task. And I think the takeaway, if I could just offer a summary line about this example that you've seen tonight, from those of us in the legacy business, I would say, could we feed the world again? Are we at a point in our political process and our political structure that we could come together in the way that Hoover and Truman came together and change the course of history, save the lives of countless people? Could we feed the world again? Well, those of us in this business will tell you that it can be done because it has been done. And I hope that this kind of program helps inspire you and others, all of us, to get out there and do what we know can be done. I think these are tremendous examples. And again, I'm very proud, very pleased. I love getting to work on behalf of this legacy. And I know our colleagues at Hoover feel the same way. All of these presidential legacies have something to offer us. And it's so exciting when you see them come together. I think we could do a lot about presidential friendships. I think there's a very real connection that people who have ascended to the highest office in the land have with one another, that it's no one else can relate to. So anyway, with that, I think we're going to throw it to questions, unless any of my colleagues have any summary comments that they wanted to add.
That's right. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question that you would like to ask one of our historians, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also like other questions that have been submitted that you would like to see answered. So our first question today is from Dwayne, and this says, they reached their goal by 1940, but wasn't that after many months of suffering and starvation in Europe? In the early part of the 1946, hadn't the U.S. fallen way short of what it had promised to contribute to the United Nations relief? Oops. I apologize, this has jumped, here we go. And rehabilitation administration when food was desperately needed in Europe. So Craig, would you like to maybe answer that one? Oh, Craig, you're muted. I'm so sorry.
Well, I don't know. And normally what I would do is go look at reports at in our holdings and verify that information. I'm not expert enough to know an answer to that one.
Okay, our next question is from a whiskey
oh.
warm. Oh, go ahead. I'm
Could
so
I
sorry.
add something to that?
Of
Sure.
course, Sam.
Yeah,
Go
I'm
for it.
sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
That was I lost the question, but United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, was that what the?
Yeah, it's about UNRWA. Yeah.
Yeah, about policy
Okay.
support of what they had
Yeah,
promised. with that.
Sure. Now, I don't know the figures, but I do know the UNRRA was a key player in these pre-Marshall Plan aid packages. Now, I don't know the exact figures. Like Craig, I'd have to look, do a little bit of research on it, but they were a key player. And, in terms of full funding, I'm not sure about that part, but I do know that they were an important agency in helping funnel U.S. aid efforts to Europe before the Economic Cooperation Administration. That is the Marshall Plan administrative instrument. So, I do believe they were a key player, but again, I don't know the exact figures. We can follow up on that, though, if you'd like us to.
All right, the next question is from a whiskey warm bowl. And can you discuss Stalin and any meetings or coordination Hoover might have attempted during his trip to Europe? Also, how the food distribution played out in the Soviet-controlled lands and other areas. Thank you, and great info in this presentation. Tom, do you maybe want to take that one?
I think Craig is better.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. As a former Russian and European Studies student, yeah. No, Hoover did not have any meetings or coordination with Stalin or the Soviet Union. Actually, he was not in favor of recognition, and he had gotten a wonderful gift from the Soviet people after they helped in the famine, and Stalin had actually tried to get Hoover to return it, and which Hoover did not do. But the more interesting part of that question is, although I'm not sure how stable things were things, whether they were communist or not at the time, but there were he did stop in Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, which obviously would become part of the orbit. And I believe he was quite successful in those areas. But definitely no interactions with Stalin or the Soviet Union at this time.
Yeah, food aid was offered to the Soviets through the Marshall Plan in 1948, and they rejected it. But yeah, earlier, there certainly was no request from the Soviets for aid that I'm aware of, other than the Lend-Lease aid from end of World War II. What's that?
They didn't need any help from the West. That's their official position.
Right.
All right, our next question is from Steve. Did Truman face any negative feedback from the Democratic Party for reaching out to Hoover? Sam, would you like to answer that one?
And nothing significant. No, Truman was able to brush off the criticism he got, and in part because Truman himself was, during the 1948 election, actually, attacked Hoover and referred to the Hoover carts, and made some comments that kind of hurt Herbert Hoover personally. To Truman, it was politics. It's you're running in the heat of the moment. I think it also hurt Truman's relationships with Dwight Eisenhower in the 1952 campaign. But so Truman, was able to kind of soften that criticism by his criticism of Hoover and the record of the Republicans, the 80th Congress, and also the Depression era of the 1930s. And Truman actually was not above mentioning Hoover in these Hoover carts. So I think that kind of helped soften any negative feedback he got. But there was real efforts to try to stop him from meeting with Hoover that first meeting. Steve Early, who was President Roosevelt's press secretary, was very, very vocal about it, and some others were too. But no, I think Truman was able to deflect that.
All right, next question is from Bryce. And he says, to what extent did Truman bringing Hoover back on board successfully rehabilitate Hoover's reputation in the public eye? Tom or Craig want to answer?
Sure. I mean, it obviously was a very impressive start. Putting Hoover back in the world spotlight and humanitarian efforts, which was outside of his kind of meteoric mining career, was really how the public knew him. I mean, at the age of 40, he was a multimillionaire, and he essentially walks away from his mining career and spends the next 50 years in humanitarian efforts, serving without any kind of compensation, and also in public capacity. So the work he did for Truman was without compensation. Because of the success of these food relief efforts, Truman uses Hoover again, and putting him on a bipartisan commission to essentially find efficiencies in government and to reduce the size of government, with the expenditures from stimulus programs from the Depression, and then, of course, obviously, the expenditures for war production. Government was taking up too much of the resources for the economy. And so Truman wanted this commission to kind of essentially dial down the size of government. And so Hoover kind of took on that challenge. And what was interesting is that it was such a popular concept that states created their little Hoover commissions. And if you Google Hoover Commission, the state of California will come up. They still have their little Hoover Commission. Anyone from the general public can provide a suggestion of how to make government more efficient. And so these things kind of brought Hoover in a positive way front and center back in the eyes of the public. And it was really up to Harry Truman. I mean, I think what Truman and Hoover do is they create that bipartisan consensus that lasts all the way to the fall of the Iron Curtain, at least as foreign policy is concerned. But it also shows that, again, that a bipartisan approach can work when you put the national interest above politics.
Excellent. All right. Our next question comes from Elizabeth, and this is kind of a big question that we might not have a specific answer to, but how many people total in Europe and Asia did the U.S. feed, and over how many years did this relief effort last? Sam, do you want to take a first crack at this?
That's an excellent question. I think that's a very hard thing to quantify. I'd have to, oops, I lost the question there. It was let's see.
Yeah, so let's see here.
How many people?
Total, and then how many years did the relief effort last?
I can answer the second question. I mean, the relief efforts lasted from almost immediately from, 1945, 46, until the end of the European recovery program, or the Marshall Plan in 1952. And I think even after then, U.S. aid packages continue, to this day. That was part of the spirit of this bipartisan foreign policy that began during these years. So we still see ongoing after the Truman administration. But the immediate crisis in Europe and Asia was the duration of the Truman administration. I'd hazard a guess on the quantity of the number of people. Millions. I think it's safe to say were aided I'd have to do some research. I don't have the numbers. Maybe you, Craig, or others might have idea on that one.
So this is Tom, and that's a question we're always asked: is how many people did Hoover feed over that 50-year period? And Hoover always claimed he fed more than 1.4 billion people. But as some of his associates pointed out, he was taking the entire population of the countries where the food relief efforts were located, and not all of the people in the countries needed that or partook in the food relief. Probably the most careful researcher of Hoover and his life, George H. Nash, has been working on trying to solve that puzzle. His best guess is that it's at least 700 million people. But I mean, I think the better way to look at it is not in terms of, whether it's 100 million or 700 million or 1.4 billion. I think Hoover understood that every person he fed, he supported the potentiality of a life, and that allowed for future generations. And so it was really an investment in the future through individual lives. And so it's a big number, but more importantly, it's just individual lives that were allowed to go on and be productive and contributing, to society.
Excellent. All right, we've got time for a few more questions here. The next question is from Jeff. And how much autonomy was given by Truman to Hoover in his role on the commission? And did Hoover make public comments against the Marshall Plan, which would have been in opposition to his personal and political philosophy? Craig, would you like to take this one?
Well, it's just my opinion. I think Hoover had a lot of autonomy during these trips. Sort of my illustration there, I think, Truman's trying to guide him to come back to the United States for an urgent message to the American people that Hoover sort of sidesteps, but solves, satisfactory. He has a satisfactory compromise to that. I'm not aware of any friction from the Truman side about what Hoover did. I'm also not aware of any public statements against the Marshall Plan. Hoover very rarely spoke out publicly in those kind of issues. The criticisms I see of Hoover about various policies over the years tend to be directly to a circle of friends, not publicly.
All right, our last question here comes from Janelle. And Janelle says, great quotes from Truman about the importance of all of this, not an invisible guest, etc. Is there a document or a speech that I could find these in to share with my students? And Sam, would you like to answer that?
Yes. Oh, sure. That particular quote comes from a Hoover speech, which is probably in Hoover's papers. They wouldn't be in the presidential papers, but in the post-presidential papers, which I'm sure, Craig, your staff could provide a copy of that if it's not online. Maybe not right away because we're all closed.
We're back in the library, yes.
Right.
Actually, that at the end of World War I, Hoover had a fundraiser where people paid $1,000 to essentially have a dinner which consisted of kind of an average third world meal of 98 cents. And at every table, there was a chair with a candle, which represented a hungry person, the invisible guest. And Actually, if you go to Hoover Heads, which is the blog site at the Hoover Presidential Library Museum, I did a blog post on the invisible guest. But yeah, we can get that speech to them.
And I know we're almost out of time, but if there's questions we're not able to answer tonight, feel free to email the Truman one certainly to to us at truman.reference@nara.gov, and we'll follow up with you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. And special thanks to Tom, Kurt, Craig, and Sam for this excellent and informative presentation. This program was presented as part of the Hoover Presidential Foundation's Third Thursday series and the Truman Library Institute's 75th anniversary programming. To learn about upcoming events, we encourage you to follow the Truman Library Institute and Hoover Presidential Foundation on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Hey,
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks you. Good night.
Yep. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. This was fun.